The ocean looked calm, just hours before it became the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Families filled the beaches, children played along the shoreline. Horse-drawn carriages rolled through the streets of Galveston, Texas, as if it were any other Saturday. No one imagined that before the sun would set, thousands of people would be dead, an entire city would lie in ruins. And one hurricane would permanently change the way America prepares for disasters. September 8, 1900, began with thick clouds gathering over the Gulf of Mexico. Galveston was one of the wealthiest and fastest-growing cities in Texas. Home to nearly 38,000 people, it was known as the Wall Street of the Southwest. Its busy port handled enormous amounts of trade. Elegant hotels welcomed visitors from across the country, and beautiful Victorian homes lined the streets. Life seemed prosperous and secure. But nearly 1,000 miles away, a powerful tropical storm had been growing for days. The hurricane had formed over the Atlantic, strengthened as it crossed the Caribbean, and entered the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Without satellites, aircraft reconnaissance, or modern weather radar, meteorologists had only scattered ship reports and basic instruments to track its movement. Forecasting a hurricane's exact path was nearly impossible. The U.S. Weather Bureau believed the storm would curve north toward Florida. Cuban meteorologists, however, warned that it was heading directly toward Texas. Their warnings proved remarkably accurate, but disagreements between weather agencies prevented the full danger from reaching the public. By early morning, Galveston residents noticed unusually high tides. Waves crashed farther inland than normal. Strong winds pushed seawater into the streets. Still, many people remained calm. Hurricanes were not uncommon along the Gulf Coast, and most storms weakened before reaching the island. Few believed this one would be any different. As the morning passed, conditions changed rapidly. Winds increased beyond 60 miles per hour. Rain fell sideways. Wooden signs ripped from storefronts. Fishing boats struggled to return to harbor. By noon, seawater flooded roads that had never before seen the ocean. Families watched from their porches as the Gulf slowly swallowed the city. Then, the real nightmare began. By early afternoon, the storm surge had grown to nearly 15 feet. Huge waves crashed over the low-lying island with unstoppable force. Entire blocks disappeared beneath seawater. Horses, wagons, furniture, and pieces of buildings floated through the streets. The island's highest natural elevation was only about 9 feet above sea level. There was nowhere to escape the rising water. At around 3 p.m., sustained winds approached 145 miles per hour, making the hurricane equivalent to a powerful Category 4 storm on today's Saffir-Simpson scale. The roar became deafening. Survivors later described the sound as thousands of freight trains crashing together without ever stopping. Homes began collapsing one after another. Families crowded into the strongest buildings they could find. Some believed brick structures would protect them. Others climbed into attics as floodwaters filled the lower floors. Parents held their children tightly while praying the walls would remain standing. Many did not. One survivor later remembered watching an entire row of houses break apart and float away like wooden toys. Within minutes, the buildings shattered against one another, throwing people into the violent current. Those who entered the flood faced broken lumber, flying debris, and waves powerful enough to sweep away anything in their path. As evening approached, the hurricane reached its full fury. The pressure dropped to an estimated 936 millibars. Windows exploded inward. Church steeples collapsed. Hotels that had stood proudly for decades began losing their roofs. Heavy timber became deadly projectiles traveling through the air at incredible speeds. Every minute brought another building crashing to the ground. One of the city's largest structures, the orphan's home, sheltered dozens of children and several caretakers. As floodwaters continued rising, those inside desperately tied the children together with rope, hoping they would remain connected if the building collapsed. Moments later, the structure was swept away by the storm. Only a handful survived. The tragedy became one of the most heartbreaking stories of the entire disaster. Across Galveston, countless families climbed onto rooftops, only to watch the houses beneath them disintegrate. Others sought refuge in public buildings that soon collapsed under the force of the wind and water. Survivors later recalled seeing entire neighborhoods vanish into the darkness, as if the ocean had simply erased them. Communication with the mainland was completely severed. Telegraph poles snapped. Telephone lines disappeared beneath the flood. Railroad bridges leading off the island were destroyed. Galveston stood alone against one of the most powerful hurricanes ever to strike the United States. By nightfall, the city had become almost unrecognizable. Thousands of people remained trapped inside collapsed buildings while the hurricane continued raging around them. Rescue was impossible. Anyone who ventured outside risked being swept into the deadly current within seconds. For hour after hour, the wind refused to weaken. The sea continued claiming homes, businesses, schools, and churches. Every passing wave carried more debris, more destruction, and more lives into the darkness. When daylight finally returned, the survivors faced a scene so devastating that many would later struggle to find words to describe it. As the first light of September 9, 1900, broke over Galveston, survivors stepped into a city that no longer existed. Streets had disappeared beneath mountains of splintered lumber. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to empty foundations. Ships rested hundreds of yards inland. Massive piles of debris stretched as far as the eye could see. The smell of seawater, mixed with smoke, mud, and destruction, filled the air. Everywhere people looked, they searched for loved ones, praying for a miracle that often never came. Rescue efforts began immediately, but conditions were overwhelming. Nearly every road was blocked by shattered homes, broken utility poles, and overturned wagons. Railroad tracks leading to the island had been destroyed, delaying outside assistance. Survivors became the first responders. They crawled through unstable piles of debris, listening for faint cries beneath collapsed buildings. Some worked with shovels, while others dug with nothing but their hands. One survivor later described hearing the voice of a young boy trapped beneath the remains of his family's home. Neighbors spent nearly 2 hours removing heavy beams before reaching him. He survived with serious injuries, but both of his parents had perished protecting him from the collapsing house. Stories like his became symbols of both unimaginable loss and incredible resilience. Another rescuer recalled discovering an elderly couple still holding hands beneath the ruins of their porch. They had survived the night by clinging to each other while floodwaters rushed around them. After nearly 12 hours trapped under debris, they were finally pulled to safety. Their story offered a rare moment of hope in a city overwhelmed by tragedy. But for thousands of others, help came too late. Historians estimate that between 6,000 and 8,000 people lost their lives, with approximately 8,000 now considered the most widely accepted figure. Nearly 1 in every 5 residents of Galveston was killed. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Thousands more were injured, and countless families lost everything they owned in a single night. The destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. More than 3,600 homes were completely destroyed. Schools, churches, hospitals, businesses, and government buildings lay in ruins. Entire city blocks had simply vanished. Financial losses were estimated at roughly $35 million in 1900, equivalent to well over $1.2 billion today, though many economists believe the true economic impact would be several times higher when measured by modern standards. The greatest challenge now became preventing disease. Thousands of bodies remained buried beneath the wreckage or washed ashore by the tide. At first, officials attempted to bury the victims at sea, but powerful currents returned many of the bodies to the beaches, forcing authorities to make the heartbreaking decision to conduct mass cremations. For weeks, smoke from funeral pyres drifted across the island as survivors mourned the dead. Despite the unimaginable devastation, extraordinary acts of courage emerged everywhere. Doctors treated the injured without rest for days. Nurses transformed damaged schools into emergency hospitals. Volunteers crossed dangerous waters by boat to deliver food, clean water, blankets, and medicine. Soldiers arrived to maintain order and assist with recovery efforts. Across the country, donations poured into Galveston as Americans united to help rebuild the shattered city. One firefighter later recalled rescuing a young girl who had survived nearly 24 hours trapped inside a collapsed attic. Dehydrated and frightened, she whispered only one question after being freed. She asked whether her mother had survived. The firefighter could not answer. It was a moment, he said, stayed with him for the rest of his life. As investigators studied the disaster, one fact became impossible to ignore. Galveston's low elevation had left it dangerously exposed to storm surge. The city had no seawall to protect it from the Gulf of Mexico. The hurricane demonstrated that powerful water, not just wind, posed the greatest threat during coastal storms. The tragedy transformed American engineering and disaster planning. In the years that followed, Galveston constructed the massive Galveston Seawall, an enormous concrete barrier stretching for miles along the coastline. Engineers also undertook one of the most ambitious construction projects in American history by raising much of the city's elevation several feet above its original level. Entire buildings were lifted using thousands of synchronized jacks, while new foundations were built beneath them. Those projects continue protecting the city more than a century later. Meteorology also changed forever. Better hurricane forecasting, expanded observation networks, improved communication systems, and eventually satellites, aircraft reconnaissance, Doppler radar, and computer forecasting models all evolved from lessons learned through disasters like Galveston. Today, millions receive hurricane warnings days before landfall, giving families valuable time to evacuate. Yet one lesson remains as important today as it was in 1900. Never underestimate the power of storm surge. Wind can destroy buildings, but rising water claims the greatest number of lives in many hurricanes. If evacuation orders are issued, leave immediately. Know your evacuation route before hurricane season begins. Prepare emergency supplies, protect important documents, and never assume that staying behind will be safer than leaving early. If you enjoy discovering the true stories behind America's greatest disasters, subscribe to American Disaster Files and leave a like. In our next documentary, we'll uncover another catastrophe that changed the nation forever and reveal the remarkable courage hidden behind one of history's darkest days. More than a century has passed since the Galveston hurricane of 1900 reshaped America's Gulf Coast. The city has been rebuilt. New generations now walk streets that were once buried beneath water and debris. The seawall still stands as a reminder of both tragedy and resilience. But nature has not forgotten. Every hurricane season reminds us that the same forces that devastated Galveston still exist today. Forecasts have improved. Buildings are stronger. Warnings arrive earlier. Yet the ocean remains as powerful and unpredictable as ever. Because behind every hurricane statistic was a family waiting for the storm to end. Behind every rescue was someone willing to risk everything for another human being. And behind every name lost in Galveston was a life filled with hopes, dreams, and loved ones. The Great Galveston Hurricane was not remembered simply because it was America's deadliest natural disaster. It is remembered because its victims changed the future, teaching lessons that continue to save countless lives more than 100 years later.